On Piketty's critique of capitalism. Thomas Piketty has caused a stir with his predictions about increasing inequality and inherited wealth. In this video, we're going to take a look at the assumptions behind Piketty's assertions in order to try and understand what all the fuss is about. It is not our aim here to take sides in the dispute between the political left and right, but rather to analyze and explain Piketty's points in a way that will hopefully be useful to both left and right wingers. Part 1. Growth Theory. First, it is important to understand that Piketty's work pertains to the subfield of economics known as growth theory. Growth theory is a great way to keep track of one's economic reasoning, but it is also notoriously hard to get it right. Here are some examples. Thomas Malthus predicted that population growth would eventually outstrip production growth, and that this would sooner or later result in a general state of impoverishment, with the population living at absolute subsistence levels. However, since his time, the population of the world has grown by a factor of 7, while production has increased by a factor of 200. The world has decisively broken free of the growth trap that Malthus thought would be inevitable. David Ricardo predicted that the landowner's share of income would gradually displace the increased returns from labor and machines, since it is possible for the number of people and machines to grow over time, while the amount of land is always fixed. Ricardo would have been right if not for the technological innovations that fostered a surge in the productivity of land, thus making people and machines the bottleneck again, and not the land. Thus, in the past 40 years, the population of the Earth has actually taken to using less land for farming, even though the population has been growing. Karl Marx predicted that returns on capital would displace the returns from labor, leaving laborers with the prospect of wages dwindling toward the subsistence minimum. Marx's fault lay in overlooking increases in the productivity of labor that were made possible by the growth of capital resulting from industrialization, which in turn led to bigger investments in more sophisticated machinery. Roy Harrod predicted that the economy would continuously experience major instability, since the need for investments is determined by the supply of labor while savings vary according to incomes. In his view, investments and savings would therefore at best be able to maintain a precarious equilibrium and can easily be knocked off balance at any time. Harrod's grim prediction was only abandoned when it was later realized that capital and labor need not be employed in a fixed ratio, thus making the economy far more robust than he assumed. Piketty's much-discussed predictions also hinge upon growth theory. So does he get it right? Let's dive in, shall we? Part 2. The Contradiction of Capitalism. In Piketty's book, he spells out what he identifies as the fundamental contradiction of capitalism. He explains it rather convolutedly, but what he says can actually be reduced to the following two statements. On the one hand, the rate of return on capital depends negatively on the savings rate. As the rate of savings declines, the rate of return on capital will increase. But on the other hand, the wealth-income ratio, that is, total capital as a percentage of GDP, depends positively on the savings rate. As savings increase, so does the wealth-income ratio. Piketty markets this as a contradiction, but as we can see, it's actually not a contradiction at all, but more of a dilemma. The reason it is a dilemma is because Piketty is in favor of keeping both the rate of return on capital and the wealth-income ratio as low as possible, and getting both of these conditions fulfilled at the same time is very hard to do in a capitalist economy. It is a bit like having your cake and eating it too. On the other hand, the contradiction or dilemma only arises because Piketty has a commitment to a left-wing vision of the economy. If one has a more right-wing, libertarian, or conservative view of the economy, then there is no contradiction or dilemma here at all. Piketty has thus not identified an objective flaw in capitalism, the way it is often portrayed in the media. He has identified a difficulty in reconciling free market capitalism, which he does not after all support, with a commitment to egalitarian, left-wing policies. Part 3. Predicting the Future. Piketty makes some long-term predictions in his book about the future of growth and capital. His assumptions here is that long-term growth is abating, and he warns us that it is problematic when the rate of return on capital is higher than economic growth in general. This is what is referred to by the famous equation about something being wrong in the economy when R, that is the rate of return, is larger than G, that is the growth rate in general. Piketty assumes that this state of affairs is going to drag on for the foreseeable future, since growth is generally assumed to be diminishing. Again, when the media talks about Piketty's work, they usually mention diminishing growth rates as a given, but in the book, Piketty actually says that this assumption is guesswork. If his guess is correct, then R may turn out to be higher than G for all foreseeable future, giving us a new aristocracy, living off the inherited money of their parents, with working people never being able to come close to that. But if growth picks up, wealth will again gravitate towards the smartest workers and entrepreneurs. All in all, it is therefore far from certain that the gap between the rates of return to capital and economic growth will widen, or that we will see a dramatic rise in the wealth-income ratio. As mentioned, Piketty actually does admit this in his book, but at the same time, the media often portrays his predictions as if they were guaranteed to happen. But why is this? Is it just because journalists are sensationalist idiots? Or might Piketty also have something to do with this? It seems to me that Piketty is at least partially to blame. In his book, he candidly does admit to guesswork, speaking of risk, predictions, chance, and probability. This is what most economists do when writing about the future. But unlike most economists, Piketty also makes many categorical proclamations about his predictions coming true, as if there were no uncertainty about whether that would happen. For instance, he speaks about his predictions as a fundamental force that is inevitable, and the problem will reach extremely high and unsustainable levels, all of which is said without qualification. It is as if Piketty sought to write two books here, one being a serious work of economic forecasting and growth theory, and the other being more of a piece of populist left-wing punditry that taps into the popular issues of the day. In both the book and in interviews with Piketty himself, you can thus see him referring to the same predictions as both inevitable and merely possible side by side. The truth of the matter is, of course, that these predictions are educated guesses and not certain in any way. I suspect that Piketty knows this too, so I don't really know why he isn't more careful to be clear about this point. Part 4. The Threat to Democracy. In his book, Piketty also says that if we do end up with a class of capital owners living off inherited wealth, then that will be a threat to our democracies. This is definitely possible, but again by no means certain. Strikingly, in spite of the enormous empirical work that Piketty has undertaken, he never actually substantiates this threat to democracy with any sort of data. Therefore, other economists have attempted to do that for him. By using the oft-cited Freedom House Index of countries around the world, it is possible to compare private fortunes with the degree of democracy in a country over time. When doing so, there appears to be no clear pattern between the two, suggesting that Piketty's thesis about the threat to democracy is incorrect. It is also possible to compare political rights to the total fixed capital inputs relative to GDP in a country over time. Doing so reveals that there is no apparent connection between the two, suggesting again that Piketty is wrong about his assertion that a prosperous rentier class is a threat to the constitution of democracy. Part 5. Higher Taxes. When his book came out, Piketty became a champion of far-left forces, but Piketty does not advocate the abolition of capitalism. He acknowledges that it is the best engine of growth that we know. Instead, he recommends a progressive tax on wealth of up to 80%. His purpose in advocating this tax is to expropriate all increases in fortunes beyond their current level relative to incomes. However, if this tax were to be implemented, it would mean a reduction in the pace of capital formation, which would lead to lowered economic prosperity in turn. We might have more equality now, but we would all be worse off 20 to 40 years from now. And for those of us who plan on having children, their generation would also be worse off because of the reduction of capital formation rates instigated by this tax. Furthermore, in absolute terms, wage earners would have to bear the greater part of the losses from this tax, since labor's share of income would still be the largest, and the rate of return on capital would increase in order to compensate for the increase in taxation. The tax, which is supposed to punish rich people and help the middle class, may therefore end up having the opposite effect. Additionally, if Piketty's policies were to be implemented in practice, rich people would simply move their fortunes to offshore accounts to avoid the spike in tax rates. Now, one may wish that wouldn't happen, or condemn such acts morally, but in practice, this is simply what would happen and there is no easy way to stop it. Piketty himself acknowledges as much, and he even calls his own policy suggestions utopian. So in conclusion, Piketty's fundamental contradiction of capitalism is not a contradiction, but a dilemma. And this dilemma is only relevant if one wants to keep both the rate of return on capital and the wealth-income ratio as a percentage of GDP low at the same time. Many left-wingers do want both of these things. So for them, Piketty's dilemma will hold true. But if one doesn't share these wishes, and many right-wingers don't, then there is no problem here. There is certainly no inherent objective contradiction the way the media often claims. Piketty makes a number of predictions about the future, most notably that growth is going to abate. As Piketty himself acknowledges, these predictions are guesses and by no means certain. If they don't come true, then many of the problems that he talks about in his book won't come true either. Piketty says many times over that a class of very rich capital owners living off inherited wealth will be a threat to democracy. But in spite of the book being almost 700 pages long, he never does anything to prove this assertion with empirical data. Other economists have tried to run analysis on this claim and found that there was no connection. The claim is likely false. The tax policies that Piketty recommend are in his own words utopian, and if they were implemented, they would probably not only harm capitalists, but also ordinary middle-class families. Piketty has done a great job collecting empirical data on the historical wealth levels in Western countries, and other economists will certainly use his data in their own studies for years to come. The attempts to discredit his data by certain right-wing journalists have generally been unprofessional, and their attempts to put their own spin on his data have generally led to absurd results. On the other hand, Piketty's own inclination to construe the problems that he points to as a question of waging war on capital formation and saving is almost somewhat impractical and convoluted. As I see it, the real problem that Piketty points to is the problem of diminishing growth rates in the Western economies, and those problems might better be counteracted by combating special interest regulations, selective business policies, crony capitalism, and the rent-seeking of lobbyists. I suspect that Piketty himself might even agree with this, since Piketty also acknowledges that economic growth in a capitalist economy tends to make everyone better off.